Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're going to do something very un-American. We're going to slowly and quietly take apart the story of the American Revolution, the bedtime version. So go ahead and dim the lights, maybe light a candle if you're feeling historically accurate. Just, avoid dumping any tea into nearby bodies of water. This isn't the dramatic, trumpet-blaring version you heard in school. There will be no rousing speeches or fast-paced musket battles. Instead, we're going to float gently through the very awkward, sometimes petty, often ironic series of misunderstandings that somehow created an entire nation. Because, spoiler, the revolution didn't start with fireworks and freedom. It started with paperwork, taxes, and a long-distance relationship that went very, very wrong. Let's drift back to the mid-1700s. The British Empire was basically the global version of that one friend who insists on splitting the dinner bill perfectly and then adds a mysterious management fee. They'd just come out of the 7 Years' War, which was technically won, but only in the same way you win a shopping spree and then cry when you see the credit card bill. The war left Britain with massive debt, so Parliament looked around the empire and said, "Who else can we bill for this mess?" And there they were, the American colonies. 13 of them scattered along the Atlantic coast like a row of mildly rebellious teenagers who still relied on their parents for rent money. Now, Britain's logic was simple, at least in theory. They'd just protected the colonies from France, from Native American uprisings, and from their own general incompetence. Surely, the colonists wouldn't mind chipping in a bit for the protection, right? They were wrong. The colonists, you see, had developed a very American allergy to being told what to do. They wanted protection, yes, but they wanted it without the parental supervision that came with it. In their minds, Britain was that overbearing landlord who shows up unannounced and insists the trash bins faced west for aesthetic consistency. The trouble began quietly, as most family feuds do. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, a tax on imported molasses and sugar. The goal was to make money off colonial trade. The result was to make everyone in Boston angry, which, to be fair, doesn't take much. The next year brought the Stamp Act, which required colonists to buy little stamps for every legal document, newspaper, and deck of cards. Basically, Britain invented microtransactions before video games did. And like all bad subscription models, it caused instant outrage. Now, Americans didn't have a problem paying taxes, really. Their problem was who was asking. They had no seats in Parliament, no vote, no say. So when Britain started mailing out tax bills, the colonies collectively said, "Hold on, you can't tax us without representation." It was a catchy slogan, and it looked great on protest banners. And what followed was a 10-year-long argument that would make any family WhatsApp group look civilized. The colonies organized boycotts, held meetings, and occasionally dressed up as Native Americans to dump tea into harbors, because apparently subtlety was not their strong suit. And while all this was happening, King George III sat back in London, confused and increasingly irritated. King George wasn't evil, just extremely out of touch. He genuinely believed he was being reasonable. After all, he had entire continents to manage, and these colonists were acting like the center of the universe. He probably thought, how hard is it to just pay a few pennies on paper goods? But the thing is, pennies add up, and resentment adds up even faster. Now let's float over to the year 1770 and to the chilly streets of Boston. It's March. Snow, sleet, and too many redcoats standing around. The tension was thick, enough to slice with a bayonet. Locals were angry that British soldiers were stationed in their town, and the soldiers were angry to be there, because, honestly, who enjoys standing guard in Boston in March? Then it happened. A crowd gathered, someone threw a snowball, someone else yelled something creative, and shots were fired. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists were dead. The newspapers called it the Boston Massacre, even though 5 deaths was considered a slow afternoon by 18th century standards. But the name worked. It sounded dramatic, emotional, and revolutionary. It wasn't the start of the war, but it was the start of the marketing campaign. Over the next few years, Britain kept doubling down. Because when your long-distance partner starts ignoring you, the logical thing is obviously to send more taxes. So in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. This allowed the struggling East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cheaper than before, but with taxes included. And you'd think cheaper tea would be a good thing. But the colonists saw through it. They realized Britain wasn't being generous, they were being manipulative. It was basically a 1700s version of, "Hey babe, I know you're mad, but I brought your favorite drink." The colonists didn't appreciate the gesture. In December 1773, a group of Boston locals dressed up as Mohawk warriors crept aboard British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. It was a weird combination of rebellion and performance art. The tea stained the water brown for days, which probably smelled terrible. But symbolically, it worked. The message was clear. We're not your obedient colonies anymore. Back in London, King George and Parliament were done playing nice. They responded with what were called the Coercive Acts, but the colonies had a more poetic name, the Intolerable Acts, which frankly sounds like a 1970s rock album. These laws shut down Boston's port, dissolved Massachusetts self-government, and allowed British soldiers to be quartered in private homes. Yes, you could literally wake up to find 2 redcoats using your kitchen table as a chessboard. Even colonists who hadn't cared much before started thinking, maybe we should do something about this. And so, in 1774, the First Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia. It wasn't exactly the Avengers. It was more like a group of awkward cousins at a family reunion, trying to agree on who should pay for the pizza. They sent polite letters to the king, asking for understanding, reconciliation, and maybe fewer taxes. The king ignored them. Of course he did. Because from his point of view, these weren't equals demanding negotiation, they were disobedient children, and he was the father, the metaphorical one at least. The colonies, however, were now teenagers sneaking out of the house to start their own lives. By early 1775, the air was thick with suspicion and gunpowder. British troops were ordered to seize colonial weapons stockpiles near Lexington and Concord. It was supposed to be a simple, controlled operation. Instead, it turned into a mess. On April 19, 1775, the first shots were fired. No one's sure who pulled the trigger. It could have been a nervous redcoat or a jittery militiaman, but history doesn't really care who shot first. Because that moment, that one confused spark, became the shot heard round the world. And just like that, what started as an argument over tea and taxes turned into a full-blown revolution. But don't picture brave patriots marching into battle yet. At this stage, the colonies weren't united. Half the population didn't even want independence. They were loyalists, loyal to the crown, or at least loyal to whoever could keep their business running and their roofs unburned. Even George Washington wasn't initially sold on independence. He was a gentleman farmer who liked things orderly, not exactly the rebel type. But when he was chosen to lead the newly formed Continental Army, he accepted, probably thinking it would be a quick, clean affair. Spoiler, it wasn't. The army he inherited was a group of farmers with hunting rifles, more used to chasing deer than facing cannon fire. It was less organized revolution and more very angry camping trip. And that's where we'll pause for now. The tea's gone cold, the candles are flickering, and the revolution has just barely begun. Next time, we'll drift through the chaos that followed, the awkward battles, the freezing winters, and the quiet irony that the revolutionaries were trying to escape one empire in order to start building another. So take a slow breath. Let your mind wander back to the sound of rustling parchment and marching boots fading into the distance. And remember, history doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just mumbles politely until everyone falls asleep.
So, the war had technically begun. The colonies were now, in theory, a rebellious army. But if you'd walked through their camps in 1775, you wouldn't have guessed they were fighting the world's biggest empire. Most soldiers had no uniforms, no training, and no idea what they were doing. One man brought a pitchfork to battle. Another forgot to bring any gunpowder. Someone tried to use a duck as a messenger. It was chaos. And in the middle of it all stood George Washington. Tall, quiet, polite to a fault, the kind of man who could probably apologize to a tree if he bumped into it. He'd been chosen as commander-in-chief mostly because he looked the part. Seriously, the Continental Congress loved that he was tall, dignified, and from Virginia. It made him seem like a good compromise between the loud New Englanders and the Southern gentlemen. Of course, once Washington actually arrived, he realized his army was not exactly an army. He described them as a mixed multitude of people under very little discipline, which is polite 18th century language for, oh no, what have I gotten myself into? The British, meanwhile, were confident. They had the most powerful navy in the world, professional soldiers, and a supply chain that stretched across the ocean. They also had expensive red uniforms, which made them easy to spot in a forest. But style points matter, apparently. In the early days, both sides did a lot of standing around. The first real standoff happened in Boston, at a place that wasn't actually called Bunker Hill. Most of the fighting happened on Breed's Hill, but the Battle of Breed's Hill didn't sound heroic enough. The colonists lost, technically, but they managed to kill and wound hundreds of British soldiers before retreating. So it was kind of like losing your first boxing match, but realizing you actually gave the champion a nosebleed. Washington soon realized that the war wasn't going to be won with enthusiasm alone. His soldiers needed supplies: food, coats, ammunition, the basics. Congress, bless them, couldn't really provide any of that. They were great at writing stirring letters, but less good at logistics. At one point, Washington wrote that his men were naked and starving, and not in a romantic way. He had troops marching in the snow without shoes, wrapping rags around their feet just to keep walking. The British soldiers, well-fed and properly dressed, probably looked at them and thought, "This is what rebellion looks like?" But morale is a funny thing. Despite the misery, the colonists kept fighting. They weren't exactly sure what they were fighting for. Independence wasn't officially declared yet. But they knew what they were fighting against. And sometimes that's enough. Let's float over to 1776, the year that looks neat on calendars and textbooks, but was in reality one long disaster sprinkled with paperwork. Washington's army was cornered around New York. The British had landed with overwhelming force, ships, soldiers, and a quiet sense of smugness. The colonists were pushed back again and again, retreating through Brooklyn, Manhattan, and eventually across the Hudson River into New Jersey. Washington's army was cold, hungry, and losing men by the day. If it were a movie, this would be the part where the soundtrack turns gloomy. It got so bad that one of Washington's generals wrote, "The game is pretty near up," which was 18th century slang for, "We're doomed." But Washington, for all his caution, had one rare burst of boldness left in him. On Christmas night, 1776, while most British and Hessian soldiers were drinking and relaxing, Washington led his men across the icy Delaware River. It was freezing, pitch dark, and dangerously poetic. They marched all night and surprised the enemy at Trenton in the morning. The battle was small, but the victory was massive for morale. Finally, the rebels had done something right. And Washington, usually stoic, was seen smiling. Or at least doing the Washington version of smiling, which probably looked like a subtle nod and a quiet, But let's be clear, the revolution didn't suddenly become a success story after Trenton. Most of the next 2 years were just a series of logistical nightmares. The Americans couldn't pay their soldiers. Farmers refused to sell supplies to the army because British gold was more reliable than colonial paper money. Even Washington's officers bickered constantly. It was less United States and more deeply confused coalition of frustrated men in muddy boots. Meanwhile, in Europe, the French were watching all this unfold with morbid curiosity. They hated Britain, obviously. It was a centuries-old rivalry. But even they were hesitant to join what looked like a losing rebellion. France only stepped in after 1777, when American forces somehow managed to capture an entire British army at Saratoga. That was the first time the world thought, wait, maybe these scruffy colonists have a chance. And speaking of scruffy, the winter of 1777 brought the army to Valley Forge. If you've ever thought you were having a rough winter, imagine being barefoot in a log hut, surrounded by snow, eating boiled shoe leather and pretending it's stew. That was Valley Forge. About 2,000 men died from disease, starvation, and cold. Washington wrote letters begging Congress for help and got mostly silence in return. Supplies arrived late, if at all. There were days when soldiers roasted candles for food. It was misery at its most monotonous. But there was a strange upside to all the suffering. During that bleak winter, the army actually learned discipline. A Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben showed up, full of energy, confidence, and a very strong German accent. He trained the troops to march, drill, and fight properly. He also apparently cursed at them in 3 languages, which surprisingly helped morale. By spring, the Continental Army wasn't great, but it was competent. And in 1778, that counted as a miracle. Back in London, things were getting awkward. The British expected the rebellion to end quickly, but now it was dragging on. Expensive, humiliating, and deeply inconvenient. The war wasn't popular anymore. Some members of Parliament started quietly asking, are we really going to keep spending this much to fight over tea and timber? King George III, however, was not backing down. He was stubborn in a way only a man surrounded by powdered wigs could be. He believed giving up would set a terrible precedent. After all, if one colony could leave, what would stop the others? So he kept sending ships, soldiers, and sternly worded letters. But across the ocean, time was wearing him down. The longer the war dragged on, the more the colonies started behaving like an actual country. They printed money, badly, argued about laws, and tried to convince each other they had any idea what they were doing. By 1778, France officially joined the war on America's side, mostly just to annoy Britain. Suddenly, this small colonial rebellion had turned into a global headache. The Spanish and the Dutch got involved too, each with their own grudges against London. It was like a petty group project where everyone hated the same classmate. Still, French assistance gave the colonists breathing room. It also brought a new sense of legitimacy. Now when the Continental Congress declared independence, it wasn't just a bold statement, it had actual backing. Speaking of independence, let's drift back slightly, because we skipped one of the most famous and ironically calm moments of the Revolution, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was July 1776, Philadelphia. Hot, humid, and filled with flies, the perfect atmosphere for writing about liberty. Thomas Jefferson, a man who looked like he could faint from loud noises, drafted the document. It was poetic, grand, and full of idealism. Also, deeply hypocritical, since many of the signers were slave owners declaring all men are created equal. But, details. The Declaration wasn't read dramatically by torchlight or shouted to cheering crowds. It was printed, posted, and gradually distributed. Most colonists didn't even know about it for weeks. And even among those who did, opinions were split. Some toasted to freedom, others muttered, "We're all going to die for this." Still, in hindsight, that moment became the revolution's emotional anchor, the calm in the storm. And somehow, despite the mess that followed, the words stuck. But we're not done yet, not even close, because while the Declaration was beautiful,
the war itself was still grinding, dirty, and slow. By 1779, both sides were exhausted. The British had shifted their focus to the south, hoping Loyalist support there would turn the tide. Spoiler, it didn't. The Southern campaign just added new layers of confusion, endless skirmishes, burnt crops, and a lot of mosquito bites. Meanwhile, Washington's army trudged on, unpaid and unappreciated. Desertion was rampant. Letters home described hopelessness, hunger, and the constant smell of unwashed wool. Yet somehow they didn't quit. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was the sheer refusal to let all the suffering go to waste. So as the war stumbled toward the 1780s, the British grew weary, the colonists half-starved, and the rest of the world mostly amused. But deep under all the exhaustion, something was shifting. The dream of independence, once just a noisy slogan, was slowly becoming reality. And that's where we'll leave things tonight. Right before the end, when the finish line is close enough to see, but still painfully far away. The war isn't over yet, but the tide is turning. And next time, we'll drift into the strange finale, how a scrappy, exhausted army somehow managed to outlast the British Empire, and what that really cost them afterward. For now, close your eyes. Imagine the faint sound of marching boots fading into a foggy dawn. And remember, revolutions don't always explode. Sometimes they just quietly refuse to stop.
By the time 1780 rolled around, everyone involved in the American Revolution was exhausted. The British were tired of shipping men and supplies across an ocean, the French were tired of paying for it, and the Americans were just tired of being tired. If you walked through a continental camp that year, you'd see soldiers wrapped in rags, lying on muddy ground, pretending they weren't freezing. The officers tried to stay optimistic, but optimism doesn't fill an empty stomach. It was less fighting for freedom and more surviving lunch. Washington, bless him, was still there, a walking symbol of quiet endurance. He'd spent 5 years balancing discipline, diplomacy, and despair. He was part general, part motivational speaker, and part unpaid therapist to an army that didn't even have socks. And even though he was the face of the revolution, the truth was, he was just holding everything together with willpower and string. At one point, his officers threatened mutiny over unpaid wages. He gave a speech so calm, so weary, that half the room cried. Not because it was emotional, but because they realized their leader was also just a guy trying not to lose his mind. Meanwhile, in the South, things were falling apart again. The British had shifted their attention to places like Charleston and Savannah, thinking Southern Loyalists would rise up and help. They did not. Instead, the region descended into small, ugly skirmishes, half war, half revenge cycle. There was no glory in it, just neighbors shooting neighbors over which king they preferred. The revolution had become deeply personal in all the worst ways. And the British, despite a few victories, found themselves bogged down in a swampy, fever-ridden nightmare. But then came Yorktown, the accidental turning point of the entire war. It's 1781. The British commander in America, General Charles Cornwallis, was supposed to secure the South and move north. Instead, he parked his army in Yorktown, Virginia, a small coastal town that looked scenic, but was strategically dumb. He thought he could wait for reinforcements by sea. Unfortunately for him, France decided to show up, in style. The French fleet, led by Admiral de Grasse, sailed up the coast and blocked the British Navy from reaching Yorktown. At the same time, Washington and French General Rochambeau quietly marched south with about 16,000 troops. It was the one moment in the war where everything actually went according to plan, mostly because Washington didn't tell Congress what he was doing until he was halfway there. By September, Cornwallis realized he was trapped, surrounded by Americans on land and the French at sea. He tried to hold out, but after weeks of bombardment, hunger, and dysentery, because of course, his army collapsed. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. He claimed to be too ill to attend the surrender ceremony, which was polite British code for, "I'm too embarrassed to show my face." His deputy handed over the sword instead. The British band played "The World Turned Upside Down," and just like that, after 6 years of chaos, the fighting mostly stopped. But here's the funny thing about wars. They don't actually end when the shooting stops. They end when the paperwork catches up. And the paperwork took a while. Back in London, news of Yorktown hit like a wet sandwich. The government was humiliated. Members of Parliament debated endlessly, trying to blame each other for the loss. Eventually, they realized it was time to cut their losses. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain officially recognized the United States of America, though probably through gritted teeth. The final document was surprisingly polite. There was no mention of all the insults, betrayals, and bad decisions. Just a quiet acknowledgement that this messy little rebellion had somehow succeeded. And while it was mostly polite, it was also a giant acknowledgement of how things had gone completely off the script of what had been planned. Meanwhile, in America, people celebrated, sort of. There were fireworks, parades, and sermons, but under the cheer, exhaustion lingered. Most of the soldiers went home broke, sick, or forgotten. Some had fought for years and never received a penny. Many couldn't even afford shoes to walk back to their farms. And those farms? Often destroyed. Fields burned, towns raided, debts unpaid. Freedom, it turned out, was not very profitable in the short term. And even Washington, hailed as the hero of the revolution, was just done. When the war ended, he resigned his commission and went back to Mount Vernon. He didn't seize power, didn't crown himself, didn't even move to a fancy palace. He just wanted to farm again, to watch things grow that didn't involve muskets. He'd seen too much chaos, too many egos, and too little gratitude.
His letters from that time are calm, but heavy. The kind of writing that sounds like someone staring out a window for too long. And the new nation he left behind was wobbly. The colonies had won independence, yes, but they hadn't figured out how to govern themselves. The Articles of Confederation, their first attempt at government, was basically a group project with no leader and no clear rules. States argued over borders, trade, and money. Inflation skyrocketed. $1 could barely buy a slice of optimism. In some places, soldiers and farmers rebelled again, this time against the new American government. It turned out that freedom from Britain didn't automatically mean freedom from bad decisions. The revolution had ended, but the experiment of America was only beginning, and it was already cracking around the edges. Let's drift for a moment to the personalities behind it all, the people who became myths, whether they liked it or not. Benjamin Franklin, the witty, aging diplomat, was still in France when the treaty was signed. He'd spent years charming royal courts and pretending to enjoy powdered wigs. He was the kind of man who could negotiate peace one day and write jokes about electricity the next. When asked what kind of government America would have, he famously said, "A republic, if you can keep it." And he was right to sound tired. Thomas Jefferson, back home, was already dreaming up grand ideas for democracy, while also somehow managing to avoid dealing with the messy realities of it. He was eloquent, idealistic, and deeply contradictory. The man who wrote, "All men are created equal," while owning hundreds of them. History loves to romanticize him. Reality, less so. John Adams was busily worrying about everything. He was the kind of man who made lists for his lists. He'd helped draft independence, but post-war politics drove him insane. He later wrote that he felt the revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, which sounds nice until you remember he spent most of it arguing with those very people. And then there was King George III, the villain in the American story, but really just a lonely, stubborn man in a golden cage. He kept his crown, but lost his sanity over the years. By the early 1800s, he was blind, mentally unwell, and still mumbling about loyalty and duty. He never quite understood what had gone wrong. From his perspective, the colonies were ungrateful children who threw away a perfectly good empire. Which is, to be fair, exactly how most parents feel when their teenagers move out. So, what did the revolution actually achieve? It created a country that was free, but also confused. It inspired revolutions around the world, while leaving many people, women, enslaved people, and Native Americans, out of that freedom entirely. It replaced one form of authority with another and called it progress. And yet, somehow, it mattered. Not because it was perfect, but because it happened at all. Because a few tired, angry farmers decided to stand up to the biggest empire on earth and didn't immediately get flattened. It wasn't destiny. It was accident, persistence, and a bit of luck. And that, in a way, is the most American thing about it. Let's drift gently toward the end. Picture it. The war is over, and the fields are quiet again, and Washington is walking slowly through his farm at dusk. The world has changed, and he's not sure how much of it he understands anymore. But the air is still, the sky is wide, and for the first time in years, there are no drums, no guns, no orders. Just the faint sound of crickets and a man who somehow became a symbol. That's how the American Revolution really ended. Not with a bang, not even with a celebration, but a long, tired exhale. A sigh of relief. A pause between what was and what might be. So, as you drift off tonight, remember, history isn't made by heroes or villains. It's made by ordinary people stumbling through extraordinary moments, trying their best not to fall apart.
The American Revolution wasn't a clean story. It was muddy, slow, and full of contradictions, which makes it, strangely, the most human kind of history. And now, you can let the candles go out. The muskets fall silent, and the sound of the past fades softly into the distance. Good night, and sleep well.
The myths and legends after the Revolution. How America rewrote its own history. When the guns finally went silent, the colonies faced a strange problem. They'd won a war, but lost the plot. No one really knew what America meant. The word looked nice on parchment, sure, but it didn't yet feel like a country. It was more like a very large group chat that suddenly realized the admin had left. So the survivors did what humans always do after chaos. They started editing the story. And as always, the editing was generous. Rewriting the beginning. Within a decade, taverns and town halls were filled with heroic retellings of events that had mostly been accidents. Lexington and Concord became symbols of divine destiny rather than confused crossfire. The Boston Tea Party, once a rowdy act of vandalism, was repackaged as the first organized stand for liberty. And King George III, a man mostly guilty of stubbornness and bad communication, was transformed into a cartoon tyrant who personally wanted to crush every farmer in New England. Because of course he was. The truth was messy, contradictory, and mildly embarrassing. But the myth was clean. The myth had good lighting, background music, and nobody forgot their shoes. Washington, the reluctant statue. Washington, who had spent most of the war muttering about supply shortages, became the marble-carved father of his country. Painters began inventing noble poses for him, heroic, glowing, sometimes suspiciously Roman. He never looked that majestic in real life. His teeth alone made sure of that. But the legend needed a flawless founder, so the imperfections were quietly sanded away. People told stories that he never swore, never lied, and supposedly chopped down a cherry tree just to demonstrate honesty. Which he didn't. The entire cherry tree thing was made up by a biographer decades later, because apparently Hero endures frostbite and supply chain collapse didn't test well with audiences. Still, Washington played along politely. When he became the first president, he rode to his inauguration in an elegant carriage, pretending not to panic. He set precedents he didn't want, accepted power he didn't enjoy, and then walked away from it, twice. Because he understood something most revolutionaries never do, that leaving quietly can be the loudest act of all. The founding frenzy. After independence, the real fighting shifted to paper, constitutions, amendments, and the occasional shouting match in Philadelphia's humidity. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 argued for 4 long months about everything from voting rights to whether the national bird should be the bald eagle or the turkey, which Benjamin Franklin naturally voted turkey. He thought eagles were of bad moral character. He wasn't wrong. The final document they produced, the U.S. Constitution, was revolutionary not for what it promised, but for how unfinished it was. It was vague, flexible, and open to interpretation, like a recipe that just says, add seasoning to taste. That's why it survived. Every generation could project their own values onto it and pretend that's what the founders meant all along. And soon enough, people started talking about the founding fathers like they were prophets. Which is funny because most of them couldn't agree on lunch, let alone divine purpose. The forgotten people. Of course, every myth requires omissions. And early America omitted quite a lot. The revolution hadn't freed enslaved people. If anything, slavery expanded in the South after the war. The same leaders who wrote about liberty also signed bills protecting the slave trade. They didn't see the irony? Or maybe they just pretended not to. Native American nations who had fought on both sides, hoping to protect their lands, found themselves crushed in peace treaties that ignored them completely. To the new government, the frontier looked like an empty canvas, which of course it wasn't. Women who'd managed farms, businesses, and entire households while the men were off playing soldier were quietly pulled to return to domestic virtue. The revolution had proven they were capable. Society simply decided to forget it. So the story narrowed. It became the tale of white gentlemen in powdered wigs creating a republic by candlelight. Simple, comforting, inaccurate. Inventing a golden age. By the early 1800s, nostalgia had already set in. The generation that fought the war started dying off, and their children began polishing their memories. Every anecdote became nobler in the retelling. Every blunder turned into strategy, and Americans loved it. Because nothing says stability like pretending your messy origin story was a flawless miracle. It's comforting to believe the founders knew exactly what they were doing, even when the letters they left behind prove they absolutely did not. King George's Coda. Across the ocean, King George III watched all this unfold from his increasingly foggy mind. He outlived the revolution by nearly 4 decades, wandering palace corridors, muttering hymns, occasionally asking servants whether the colonies still existed. When told they'd become a nation, he supposedly said, "They will do well," which was unexpectedly gracious for a man who'd lost half a continent. Maybe he realized that letting them go was the only way the British Empire could keep its sanity. Or maybe he'd just run out of energy to be angry. Either way, history quietly forgave him by turning him into the harmless monarch of stage musicals and bedtime stories. The French regret. Meanwhile, France, America's indispensable ally, got a little too inspired by the whole liberty thing. Within a few years, Parisians were storming their own prisons and redecorating with guillotines. The Americans watched nervously and decided very firmly that they preferred their revolution slow, polite, and largely free of head baskets. So they invented a sort of moral distance. Our revolution was rational, theirs was chaos. Never mind that both were born from hunger, taxes, and arrogance in powdered wigs. The Age of Memory. By the mid-18th century, the revolution had faded into distant memory, perfect for myth-making. Textbooks started telling the simplified version: the brave colonists, the cruel redcoats, the heroic midnight riders. No one mentioned inflation, dysentery, or the sheer boredom of waiting weeks for orders to arrive by horse. Every generation added a new layer of paint until the real faces disappeared underneath. It wasn't malicious, it was just human nature. People crave neat stories, ones that make sense, end cleanly, and don't require footnotes. And so the revolution became bedtime material, a lullaby about freedom, sung in slow rhythm, where everyone does the right thing and the fireworks go off exactly on cue. But beneath the myth, the echoes of the real war never stopped. They lived on in arguments over federal power, in protests, in the endless debate about what liberty actually means. Every generation refights the revolution in miniature, not with muskets, but with words, laws, and opinions shouted on screens. The slogans stay the same, only the costumes change. And maybe that's fitting. Because the revolution wasn't a single event. It was a habit, a constant, restless desire to test authority, even when the authority is your own. So when you hear the story next, the one with drum rolls, powdered wigs, and perfectly timed declarations, remember the quieter version too. The one where Washington can't find boots for his men, where Franklin is napping through half of Congress, where the shot heard round the world might have been a misfire, where freedom came wrapped in contradictions and nobody really knew how it would turn out. Because that's the real heart of it, not the noise, but the uncertainty. The revolution wasn't destiny fulfilled. It was people fumbling in the dark, hoping the candle didn't go out.
And that's where we'll leave it tonight. The war is long over. The myths have settled, and the restless experiment they began still hums quietly in the background, like a soft, uneven heartbeat. So let your mind drift, past the parades, past the paintings, past the polished speeches, back to the cold nights, the muddy boots, and the faint flicker of a fire in Valley Forge. A handful of people trying to invent a future, one tired breath at a time. Good night, dreamers of liberty, and may your revolutions, whatever they are, stay peaceful, a little clumsy, and gently boring enough to fall asleep to.
This part zooms into what happened after the revolution. Not politically, but mythically. How the Founding Fathers slowly turned into the historical equivalent of polite household ghosts, floating around American memory, saying wise things they definitely never said. Dim the lights again. Let's drift. Part 5. The Afterlife of the Revolution. How the Founding Fathers became American ghosts. When the revolution ended, the United States stepped into a new era, one that was supposed to be about building roads, printing money that didn't immediately collapse, and deciding how many wigs Congress was legally allowed to wear. But Americans did something much more dramatic instead. They started summoning ghosts. Not literal ones, of course, although the average tavern storyteller in 1805 definitely had the haunted look of someone who'd been overserved rum at least twice a week. No, these ghosts were symbolic. The founders hadn't even been dead for a decade before people began turning them into supernatural national mascots, elegant, infallible patriots, drifting through history like calm, powdered apparitions. Never mind that the real men had been anxious, contradictory, and, at least in Franklin's case, often shirtless. But they were needed for a new kind of work now. Moral guidance, myth maintenance, inspiration on demand. And so, the afterlife of the revolution began. Washington, the silent ghost in the corner. Washington died in 1799, just shy of the 1800s, which meant Americans entered the new century without the one man who made them feel vaguely supervised. The country mourned, of course. Church bells rang, poets wrote sentimental lines. People who had never met him insisted they'd always known he was fatherly, even though he was famously awkward with emotional expressions. And then the myth-making started rolling like a very slow, very solemn snowball. Washington became the nation's gentle, invisible chaperone, a sort of historical emperor penguin presiding over the fragile hatchlings of democracy. Every time someone gave a speech, they quoted Washington, even if the words were things he never said. Like the cherry tree story, invented decades later by a writer desperate for book sales, or the claim that Washington refused to swear, when multiple diaries mention that he absolutely did, just very quietly. But that didn't matter. People needed a flawless figure, and Washington was perfect. Tall, stoic, composed, and conveniently unable to argue after 1799. He became the ghost hovering over every political debate. Would Washington approve? Would Washington frown disapprovingly? Would Washington, in his infinite wisdom, support your slightly questionable tax proposal? Washington didn't answer because he was dead, which made him incredibly useful. Thomas Jefferson joins the ether. Jefferson died in 1826, on July 4th of all poetic days, which practically guaranteed his immediate elevation to celestial founding father status. He and John Adams died within hours of each other, like two old men who realized they couldn't win the philosophical argument if the other guy was still alive. Jefferson's afterlife was complicated. He'd written the Declaration, which made him the unofficial poet laureate of freedom. But he'd also kept dozens of enslaved people at Monticello, which considerably dulled the halo. The nation solved this by quietly ignoring the contradictions. For nearly a century, Jefferson floated through memory as the calm, brilliant, articulate guardian of democracy who always spoke incomplete paragraphs. Statues of him popped up everywhere. Him holding documents, him looking noble, him gazing thoughtfully at the horizon, as if pondering liberty instead of worrying about crop prices. It wasn't until much later, long after his ghost had settled comfortably into textbooks, that people began asking awkward questions, like, wait, how does the guy who wrote "All men are created equal" own human beings? Jefferson's ghost did not respond, probably because it was too busy drifting around Monticello, being dramatically disappointed in modern architecture. Benjamin Franklin, the social butterfly ghost. Some men are born to become myths. Franklin was born to become a franchise. While Washington's ghost was stoic and solemn, Franklin's was the opposite, cheerful, quirky, and extraordinarily good at self-promotion. Even during his life, Franklin had crafted his own persona, the wise old sage, half scientist, half philosopher, half mischievous uncle who knows how to fix your stove and your marriage in the same afternoon. After his death, in 1790, people expanded this image until Franklin became the all-purpose ghost of American cleverness. He invented lightning rods, bifocals, postal routes, witty sayings, and apparently half the quotes on the internet, most of which he never said. But that didn't stop people from attributing everything remotely clever to him. Early to bed and early to rise? Sure. He who is good for making excuses is seldom good for anything else. Fine. Beer is proof that God loves us? No, but it feels like something he'd say at a tavern, so Americans simply decided he did. Franklin became the friendly ghost, drifting through schools, calendars, and inspirational posters. Whenever Americans wanted a wise grandfather figure, they conjured Franklin. Polite, jovial, slightly mischievous, a ghost with a sense of humor. John Adams, the ghost nobody invited, but who shows up anyway. Adams didn't get the smooth, graceful afterlife his colleagues enjoyed. He was too honest for that, too sharp, too grouchy in his letters. Adams spent most of his real life worrying that he wasn't appreciated enough, which, ironically, ensured that his ghost would be exactly the opposite of Franklin's cheerful apparition. Adams became the patron spirit of anxious overachievers. For decades, he hovered at the edges of America's memory like a stern librarian waiting for everyone to stop talking so he could correct them. He wasn't mythologized so much as retroactively tolerated. People knew he mattered. They just weren't entirely sure how to turn his complex personality into a bedtime story. Eventually, they solved this by casting him as Washington's loyal deputy and Jefferson's philosophical rival. A neat package. Adams, the earnest ghost, the founding father who always seemed one argument away from a headache. The ghosts spread out. By the mid-1800s, the founding fathers had fully transitioned from historical figures to national spirits. They were evoked during political campaigns, quoted during sermons, and occasionally dragged into debates none of them could have imagined, like tariffs, slavery, suffrage, taxation, trade, foreign policy, even street lighting. People began documenting their belongings like sacred relics: Washington's sword, Jefferson's desk, Franklin's spectacles, Adams' letters. Pieces of furniture became artifacts. Even the chairs at Independence Hall were treated with reverence, although realistically, most of them were wobbly and uncomfortable. The Revolution itself became a sacred memory. Paintings replaced reality. Stories replaced diaries. The founders were now ghosts that lived not in haunted houses, but in public imagination, summoned whenever comfort, inspiration, or political justification was needed.
When a revolution ends, history books usually close the chapter with a grand sentence, something bold, something final, something that makes it sound like the credits rolled, the flag waved, and everyone clapped politely before returning to their farms. But the real world doesn't have clean endings. It just keeps going. And in the case of the American Revolution, it kept going in strange, lopsided, sleep-deprived ways. While the founders became statues, everyone else was left to figure out how to live in a country that didn't yet know what it was. The veterans who drifted home. The soldiers went home first, at least the ones who could. Many of them were limping, starving, or missing bits and pieces that made farm work difficult. Their uniforms were in tatters, their pay in arrears, and their letters from home often described families barely hanging on. They had fought for freedom, but not necessarily for fortune. When they arrived back in their villages, they found empty barns, overgrown fields, and debts that didn't care how many redcoats they'd chased. Some tried to collect the pay Congress had promised them, which turned into a fun little scavenger hunt, since the national treasury was mostly composed of dust and optimism. Many soldiers received certificates of debt, which was basically the 18th century version of an IOU written in crayon. Others sold their certificates for a fraction of their value just to afford food. And when the government still couldn't pay up, they protested, politely at first, and then less so. In Massachusetts, a group of angry veterans led by Daniel Shea decided that maybe liberty wasn't worth much if you were starving in it. They launched a brief uprising in 1786, Shea's Rebellion, demanding debt relief and fair treatment. Washington called it a melancholy proof that the revolution wasn't quite over. It wasn't a new war, just unfinished business. The Forgotten Loyalists. Not everyone who lived through the revolution celebrated independence. About a fifth of the colonial population had remained loyal to Britain, sometimes out of conviction, sometimes out of fear, sometimes because they simply didn't want to move their tea sets again. When the war ended, thousands of loyalists packed up and left. Some sailed to Canada, others to the Caribbean. A few went back to England, where they discovered, to their surprise, that nobody cared about their loyalty anymore. They'd sacrificed everything: homes, businesses, friends, for a crown that barely noticed their departure. Their American neighbors, meanwhile, quietly took over their property. It wasn't revenge exactly, just opportunism, history's favorite coping mechanism. The Loyalists became the revolution's ghosts, erased from the national story, remembered only as polite warnings about picking the wrong side of history. The women who held it together. While the soldiers were off chasing freedom, women were holding the country together with sheer willpower, a few pieces of twine, and whatever currency they could invent on the spot. They ran farms, managed stores, kept ledgers, and wrote the letters that sustained morale. When supplies ran out, they bartered. When crops failed, they improvised. When soldiers didn't come home, they rebuilt anyway. But when the revolution ended, their work was quietly pushed aside. Society gently reminded them that liberty was a man's business, that their place was the domestic sphere, as though patriotism evaporated when you stepped into a kitchen. Some refused to fade. Abigail Adams famously wrote to her husband, the ever-nervous John, asking him to remember the ladies when drafting new laws. He didn't. Almost nobody did. Still, women kept running the real machinery of independence. Households, education, moral guidance, and the slow evolution of social life. They didn't get statues, but they got something more lasting. The quiet, uncredited stability that keeps nations alive when the heroes are done posing. The enslaved people who waited for freedom. For many Black Americans, the revolution was an unfinished promise. Freedom had been the slogan, but not the outcome. Thousands of enslaved men had joined the British Army, lured by offers of emancipation. Some actually received it, resettling in Nova Scotia, the Caribbean, or even Sierra Leone. But most found themselves displaced, unwanted, and forgotten. In the new United States, the ideals of liberty and equality were carefully rationed. The northern states began gradual emancipation. The South doubled down on slavery, arguing that freedom didn't apply to everyone. And so the revolution, that great beacon of liberty, became a paradox. A country built on freedom continued to run on forced labor. For another century, the contradiction simmered like an old wound that refused to close. The ghosts of the revolution weren't just the founders. They were the enslaved people whose names never made it into textbooks, whose hopes were postponed, until someone finally noticed that liberty with an asterisk wasn't liberty at all. The Indian nations that paid the price. If the revolution was a rebirth for the colonies, it was a catastrophe for Native American nations. Many had allied with the British, not because they loved monarchy, but because Britain had at least tried to limit colonial expansion into their lands. When the British lost, those protections vanished. The new United States looked west and saw opportunity. The people already living there saw invasion. Tribes that had fought alongside both sides, the Iroquois, the Shawnee, the Cherokee, now faced relentless pressure from settlers who saw the frontier as a blank page. It wasn't blank, of course. It was full of stories, treaties, and families that'd been there long before the Declaration of Independence was even an idea. But post-war America wasn't ready to listen. The revolution's rhetoric of freedom stopped at the edge of white settlement. Beyond that, the land of liberty became the land of dispossession. History tends to frame that expansion as destiny, but for those who lived it, it felt more like erasure. And that's one of the quiet tragedies the patriotic songs don't include. The economic chaos nobody mentions. For all its talk of independence, the new republic was basically broke. The Continental Congress had printed so much paper money during the war that inflation made it nearly worthless. Farmers couldn't sell crops, merchants couldn't get credit, and the government couldn't pay its debts to soldiers, to France, or to itself. Not worth a continental became a popular insult, and it was accurate. The economy was held together with threadbare optimism and bartering. When Alexander Hamilton took over the treasury a few years later, he found financial records that looked like they'd been kept by a distracted raccoon. So he decided to nationalize state debts, create a bank, and basically invent the U.S. financial system from scratch. It worked, mostly. At least well enough for future generations to argue about it forever. But in the early years, ordinary people were just trying to survive, planting, trading, borrowing, and hoping that their new government would one day figure out how to make coins that didn't collapse in value faster than wet bread. The everyday revolution. Despite all that chaos, something remarkable did happen. Ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, teachers, sailors, began to see themselves as citizens. That word had weight now. It wasn't just a subject of a king or a name on a tax list. It meant something. It meant you had a say, however small, in how your world worked. Town meetings flourished. Newspapers multiplied. Coffee houses became political laboratories, filled with half-informed but enthusiastic debates. The revolution had made people restless, in a good way. Once you tell the world that governments exist by the consent of the governed, it's very hard to convince people to stay quiet again. And they didn't. They questioned, they petitioned, they voted. Not always wisely, but earnestly. That's the real revolution, the slow, steady, stubborn insistence that ordinary people mattered, that a farmer's opinion could weigh as much as a nobleman's, that governance wasn't a performance, it was participation. The slow fade into routine. By the early 1800s, the fireworks of revolution had faded into everyday life. People were too busy
farming, marrying, dying, and moving west to think about ideology. Freedom had turned into habit, and habit into normalcy. The young nation wasn't glamorous. It was dusty, uneven, and perpetually under construction. But that was kind of the point. The revolution had never promised perfection, just a chance. And if you zoom out far enough, that's exactly what people built. A perpetual work in progress. Messy, contradictory, alive. The sleepy reflection. If you were to walk through a quiet American town in, say, 1805, a generation after independence, you wouldn't find fireworks or flags. You'd find life. Slow, ordinary, human life. A blacksmith hammering in the early light. A mother teaching her child to read from a worn Bible. An old veteran sitting by a fence, wondering if the country he fought for turned out the way he hoped. Probably not, but close enough. That's how revolutions end. Not with trumpets, but with sighs. Not in parades, but in quiet fields. Not in marble halls, but in kitchens and workshops, where the real nation takes shape. The American Revolution didn't end at Yorktown, or in Philadelphia, or with the signing of anything. It ended and began again every time an ordinary person decided they belonged to something larger than themselves. The gentle drift back to sleep. So, as we drift to the end of this long, rambling, unhurried story, remember that the revolution wasn't just about liberty, or kings, or taxes. It was about people, confused, imperfect, hopeful people, trying to design a better life and mostly succeeding by accident. It's easy to see the founders as marble saints, but the truth is more interesting and somehow softer. They were tired, often cranky, frequently broke, and occasionally brilliant. And that's what makes their story worth whispering about while the rest of the world sleeps. Because beneath the noise, the battles, and the slogans, the revolution was never about victory. It was about endurance. It was about finding balance between chaos and calm, between ideals and reality, between dreams and daylight. So, tonight, let it all fade. The muskets, the flags, the marble busts staring proudly into nothing. Let it all dissolve into the same soft hum of human persistence, the one that's carried forward through every century since. History, after all, isn't a march. It's a long, sleepy walk home. Good night, traveler. Rest easy. The revolution will still be there in the morning, quietly, patiently, humming in the background of every dream.
Hey again, still awake? Or kind of half listening with one ear buried in a pillow? Perfect, because that's the correct state of mind for this next beautifully boring phase of the American Revolution. We're now drifting through the years after the big, shiny victory. The fireworks are done, the muskets are silent, and the founding fathers are mostly broke, tired, and arguing over paperwork. See, the revolution didn't end with George Washington triumphantly galloping into a sunset. It ended with Congress sitting in a hot room, surrounded by unpaid bills, unpaid soldiers, and unpaid patients. It was all very unpaid. Let's float through this moment, shall we? The victory nobody could afford. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the United States officially existed. Britain said, "Fine, take your freedom. Good luck managing it." And the American delegation, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay, probably looked proud, but also slightly terrified. Because while they technically won independence, the country was flat broke. Like selling your grandma's silverware broke. The Continental Congress had been printing paper money, Continentals, that was so worthless, people used it for wallpaper. Farmers wouldn't even trade eggs for it. The phrase, "not worth a Continental," became a thing, and it meant exactly that. So while the British Empire licked its wounds across the Atlantic, the newborn American Republic was crying in a corner, trying to pay its rent. Washington, the exhausted demigod. And then there was George Washington, the man everyone wanted to keep as a symbol, but who desperately wanted to go home. By 1783, he was tired of everything: war, politics, and humans in general. He'd spent 8 years trying to keep an unpaid army from falling apart, writing stern letters to Congress that basically said, "Hey, if you don't pay these guys, they might just overthrow you." Which almost happened. The Newburgh Conspiracy was a near mutiny among the officers who were done waiting for money and respect. Washington defused it with a famously emotional speech, putting on his glasses and saying, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me, for I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." Everyone cried. Crisis averted. Probably the most dramatic thing that ever happened in a barn full of cranky soldiers. After that, Washington retired to Mount Vernon. He wrote letters about farming. He grew wheat. He tried to invent new plows, and probably just hoped no one would ever ask him to be president. Spoiler, they absolutely would. Britain's Big Sad. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Britain was going through a breakup phase that can only be described as Emotional Damage 1770s edition. The loss of America was a massive humiliation. The empire's pride was dented. People blamed everyone. Parliament blamed the king blamed Parliament, and the newspapers blamed both. King George III took it the hardest. The man was obsessed with order, obedience, and moral duty. Losing 13 colonies felt like losing 13 rebellious children. He reportedly told his prime minister, "I am the last to consent to the separation, but the first to meet the necessity," which is monarch speak for, "Fine, whatever, I'll deal with it." But the pressure cracked him. The American War had pushed George's mental health into visible decline. The madness of King George was already a whisper in the halls of power, though no one dared say it out loud. He began showing erratic behavior, long rambles, sudden bursts of energy, conversations with invisible people. Historians later diagnosed him, posthumously of course, with porphyria, a blood disorder that can cause mental instability. The irony? The king who lost America was literally losing his mind at the same time. It's tragic. It's poetic. And, in a sleepy way, it's exactly the sort of melancholy that makes this story feel human. The French regret everything. And remember France? The cool older cousin who helped America just to annoy Britain? Yeah, that didn't go great for them either. King Louis XVI spent millions, money France did not have, arming and supplying the American rebels. He basically went into national debt just to poke the British in the eye. When the war ended, France got zero reward. No land, no money, no trade advantage. Just a massive pile of debt and a bunch of smug Americans saying, "Thanks for the help." So, 10 years later, the French people were starving. Taxes were rising, and everyone started wondering why their king was spending money on someone else's revolution instead of fixing France. And then, the guillotine happened. So, in a roundabout way, you could say the American Revolution helped cause the French Revolution, which means George Washington, in some indirect cosmic sense, helped get King Louis XVI's head chopped off. Diplomacy is weird that way. The empire adjusts, reluctantly. Britain, after all the crying and economic sulking, eventually moved on. Sort of. They turned their attention elsewhere, to India, to Africa, to Australia. The empire decided to just keep empiring, because if you lose one colony, you can always colonize 3 more. But they also learned from their mistakes. A little bit. The British government began treating its remaining colonies with slightly more care, offering them limited self-rule instead of pure exploitation. They called it enlightened imperialism, which is basically saying, "We're nice now, trust us." Canada, for instance, got a lot more autonomy. Ironically, the British learned how to manage their empire properly only after losing America. So, maybe the revolution worked out for everyone, except for all the people who went bankrupt, insane, or got decapitated in the process. Meanwhile, in the new America. Back in the United States, everyone was still arguing. The Articles of Confederation, the country's first government, were a mess. It created a weak Congress with no power to tax, no executive branch, and no way to enforce anything. Each state was basically its own little kingdom, with its own currency and trade laws. There were border disputes, economic collapse, angry farmers rioting. At one point, A group of debt-ridden veterans in Massachusetts, led by a farmer named Daniel Shays, started an armed rebellion. It was quickly crushed, but it scared everyone. Because if this was freedom, it was starting to look like chaos. That's when a few familiar names came back into the spotlight. Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, and yes, Washington again. They met in Philadelphia in 1787 to fix the Articles. Instead, they threw them out completely and started from scratch. You know, as one does. The Great Rewrite. The Constitutional Convention was part debate, part therapy session, and part power grab. Everyone had their own idea of what America should be. Alexander Hamilton wanted a strong central government that looked suspiciously like a monarchy with better PR. Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't even there, wanted states' rights and small government. Madison quietly scribbled notes and invented the modern Constitution. And Benjamin Franklin, he mostly made jokes, drank wine, and occasionally said wise things that everyone wrote down. And when the Constitution was done, it created the presidency, the Congress, the Supreme Court, all the things that still exist today. It was like a second revolution, but this time fought with pens instead of muskets. The reluctant president. And of course, everyone turned back to Washington. He really didn't want the job. He was living a quiet life, farming and pretending to be retired. But when the entire country unanimously voted for him, he couldn't exactly say no. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. He didn't smile at his inauguration. He didn't give a fiery speech. He just took the oath, went home, and wrote in his diary,
"About 10 o'clock, I bade adieu to Mount Vernon, to private life, and to domestic felicity." In other words, goodbye peace and quiet, hello national drama. He served 2 terms reluctantly, and then refused to run again, because even back then he understood that presidents shouldn't stick around forever. The quiet legacy. So that's where the revolution really ends, not on the battlefield, but in quiet compromise. It ended with a weary general trying to be a good farmer, a king struggling with his sanity, a country trying to invent itself, and an empire learning how to recover. It's not a heroic ending, it's a human one. And maybe that's why it still matters, because the American Revolution wasn't just about battles or flags or freedom slogans. It was about people, messy, proud, insecure people, trying to figure out what the word independent actually meant.
Welcome back, dreamers. You've made it to the quiet end of the revolution, the part of the story where the candles burn low, the letters yellow with time, and everyone's powdered wig starts to look a little frayed. So, let's settle in. Loosen that last bit of tension in your shoulders, because now we're gliding through the slow fade-out, the years when the revolution became, well, just history. The slow fade of the Founding Fathers. You know how after a movie's big battle scene, there's that slow montage of the heroes walking away in silence? That's basically what happened after 1790. The Founding Fathers aged fast. Washington retired for real this time, finally escaping the endless parade of politics. He returned to Mount Vernon, built a whiskey distillery, because apparently, after 8 years of war and 8 years of presidency, the only logical next step was alcohol, and spent his last years writing polite letters and avoiding visitors. He died in 1799, quietly, surrounded by his family. The news spread slowly across the young nation, and people wept as if they'd lost their collective dad, which, in a way, they had. Benjamin Franklin had already passed a few years earlier, leaving behind a collection of clever quotes, half-finished experiments, and about a dozen illegitimate children who could probably form their own colony. John Adams, meanwhile, had become the country's second president, and discovered that no one liked him as much as Washington. He was prickly, defensive, and constantly feuding with Thomas Jefferson, who, for a guy who wrote about liberty, spent most of his time complaining about taxes. By the early 1800s, the founding generation was fading into memory. Their portraits hung in parlors. Their signatures became currency. Their letters got filed away in dusty archives. The revolutionaries were becoming relics, almost mythic in how ordinary they'd been. Britain's new normal. Across the sea, Britain slowly recovered its ego. The loss of America stung for a while, but soon the British Empire found new places to conquer. Canada, India, the Caribbean, parts of Africa, Australia. If anything, Britain doubled down on imperialism, because when you lose 13 colonies, you might as well build 50 more. The Industrial Revolution kicked in, and with it came wealth, machines, and child labor. London grew filthy and rich at the same time, and King George III, the man who'd lost America, slipped deeper into his mental illness. By 1810, he was officially declared insane. His son, George IV, took over as Prince Regent, a man famous mostly for wearing tight trousers, hosting lavish dinners, and avoiding responsibility. So, yes, the empire that once ruled the world was now run by a guy who looked like a fancy pudding. History, as always, has a sense of humor. The French connection continued. France, on the other hand, was busy having a nervous breakdown. Remember that huge debt they took on helping the American Revolution? Yeah, that bill came due. By 1789, the French economy had collapsed. Bread prices skyrocketed, people were starving, and King Louis XVI, America's old buddy, had absolutely no idea how to fix it. The French Revolution broke out that same year, and it made America's rebellion look like a tea party. Heads rolled, literally. The monarchy was abolished. Louis and Marie Antoinette both lost their heads. And somewhere, Benjamin Franklin probably would have said, "Told you so," if he hadn't already been dead. Napoleon rose from the chaos, crowned himself emperor, and basically said, "You know what this revolution needs? Another monarchy." So, in a weird twist of fate, America's quiet, philosophical rebellion inspired France's fiery, bloody one. Different vibes, same existential crisis. The forgotten losers. Of course, not everyone in the revolution ended up with statues and parades. Let's talk about the Loyalists, the people who stayed loyal to Britain. When the war ended, they were treated about as kindly as you'd expect. Property confiscated, houses burned, reputations ruined. Thousands fled north to Canada, where they built little pockets of British culture and politely complained about the weather. Some stayed in America and tried to blend in. Others left for England, where they discovered that no one really cared about their loyalty. And then there were the indigenous people, the original inhabitants of the land, who had been promised protection by both sides and betrayed by both. The revolution didn't bring them liberty. It brought more settlers, more treaties, more broken promises. For Native nations, the American victory was less about freedom and more about survival. That's one of those quiet, uncomfortable truths that history tends to whisper instead of shout. The dream versus the reality. By the early 19th century, the United States was figuring out what freedom actually meant and realizing it wasn't so simple. The new nation talked endlessly about liberty and equality while still allowing slavery to exist. It praised independence while suppressing indigenous autonomy. It bragged about democracy while letting only wealthy white men vote. Basically, America was a teenager, full of ideals, loud opinions, and absolutely no self-awareness. The Constitution, brilliant as it was, also contained compromises that would haunt the country for centuries. The Revolution had promised a new beginning, but the same old hierarchies lingered. And yet, something new really had begun. A republic survived where few thought it could. The idea that ordinary people could govern themselves didn't just stay on paper, it became reality. Slowly, imperfectly, awkwardly, but still reality. How history softens everything. Over time, the revolution became a bedtime story for a restless nation. The messy politics, the unpaid soldiers, the bad tempers, all that faded. What remained were the symbols: Washington crossing the Delaware, the Liberty Bell, the Declaration of Independence perfectly worded and conveniently idealized. Generations later, school children memorized dates and names without realizing that half of the heroes barely liked each other. The revolution became myth because myth is easier to love than reality. And maybe that's okay, because nations, like people, need stories to fall asleep to, even if they're a little embellished. The sound of the past settling. If you could stand on a quiet field where the revolution once raged, you'd hear nothing. The musket fire is gone, the flags have rotted, the ghosts have grown tired of haunting. Just wind, maybe a few birds, maybe a faint echo of drums if you really stretch your imagination. History eventually gets sleepy too. It curls up in textbooks and archives, waiting for someone to dust it off. And when we do, we find that it's never quite what we expected. Always more human, more fragile, more relatable. The American Revolution wasn't really about glory. It was about exhaustion, stubbornness, and a weird, persistent hope that people could be better if given the chance. It wasn't perfect, it never was, but it was real. A soft goodbye. So here we are, drifting to the end of the long revolution. The war that started over tea and taxes turned into a slow, sprawling experiment in how to run a country and how not to. The men and women who lived through it faded into portraits, letters, and legends. And we, 2.5 centuries later, can only listen to their echoes, like the slow ticking of an old clock in another room. Because that's what history really is. Not a shout, not a battle cry, but a whisper that keeps repeating, "Remember me." So, if you're still awake, congratulations. And if you're already drifting off, well, you're doing it right. This has been the real story behind the American Revolution. And as all good revolutions eventually do, this one ends in silence.